Today's video, we're going to be discussing the pros and cons of canister filters and sump filters, and also comparing the two together. We keep a lot of large cichlid tanks, mostly freshwater, and we usually go with sumps or canisters, so we get asked all the time what our preferred filtration option is, and we actually have pretty differing opinions between the two of us.
Yeah, I think I prefer canister filters and you prefer sump filtration, so we're going to discuss and debate, so why don't we dive right in?
So the most common types of filtration that you'll usually see out there are sponge filters, hang on the back filters, canisters, and sumps. Today we are focusing on canisters and sumps, which are usually the most commonly used on big tanks. And before we get into the comparison between the two, let's give a quick overview of what they are. And Alec, you want to start with canisters?
Yeah, so I'm a proponent of canister filters. I have two canister filters on my 220 behind me here, which are FX6s. And canister filters are just so simple and easy to maintain and set up. It's basically a bucket of water and filter media set in different stages, and you basically set it and forget it for about 6 months at a time, in which case you clean it out and set it right back up, and it's really no hassle at all.
And when it comes to the sumps are usually like a little aquarium under your bigger aquarium, and it's usually in some different chambers where you'll have mechanical filtration in terms of filter socks or something to catch a lot of the debris. Water will then flow into the next chamber, which will have usually your heaters or biological filtration. And then that third chamber could be open to a lot of different things. And we'll talk a little bit more about the sump and the versatility of it. But ultimately, you'll have a return pump in one of the last chambers of the sump, which will keep the flow going back up to the tank, back down to the sump, and just kind of the cyclical nature of the sump. And overall, both are great options in our opinion for big tanks, but they might have specific nuances to them that you would rather have one over the other depending on your own preferences. And that's what we're gonna get into today.
All right, so first let's start out with the pros of having a canister filter. Canister filters are simple and easy to set up. You can really go buy a canister filter anywhere at any type of pet store, fish store, big box store, whatever. They're basically set up for you. They come with instructions, they come with different compartments that they already have the media laid in for you, and it's just really simple and easy, and you can always add canisters to a tank if you need more filtration, or take off canister filters if you need less, and it's really simple and easy. On top of the simplicity of a canister filter, it's also very quiet. We have two canister filters running behind me here. I also have another big tank set up to my left here, which has another two different canister filters, and it's both very quiet and very good for show tanks.
And canisters do go underneath most stands, so that's another plus, is that you basically shut the doors to your stand and you don't hear them.
It's very simple, easy, and quiet. Another pro of having a canister filter is you can kind of optimize the different trays of media within your canister filter. You can set up the trays that you switch out most of, like chemical filtration at the top. You can put whatever kind of biological filtration you can anywhere in any tray, or you can also load up on maybe one canister being heavy on mechanical filtration with another canister being heavy on biological filtration, and you can kind of mix and match whatever kind of media you want.
And kind of another pro, I would say, of canisters is that they are kind of like big buckets of water, so they do add some gallons to your overall tank volume. Not quite as much as a typical sump, but the negative to that is that when you're cleaning a canister filter, I would say that's the biggest negative, is that it really is a pain. Of all the filter options, it's the one I dread the most. You have to take off the hoses to the canister, which almost always drip a little bit of water on you. You have to pull it out, and if it's full of water, super heavy. Some have little valves that you can like drain the water, but for the most part, you're going to be picking up maybe a 30 to 50 pound bucket of water essentially and trying to clean that. And it's also something that is really easy to procrastinate. You don't see it, it's underneath your tank. So you can let it go for months and months without cleaning it. And one time I just let my FX6 go for a while, and I just started noticing the flow was just really low, and I realized I hadn't cleaned that in probably 9 months, and I just needed to do it. Once I cleaned it, the flow came back to its original speed, but overall that's definitely a negative. Is just the cleaning of a canister is a hassle. There's no way around that.
True story. I've fallen victim to neglecting to clean a canister filter because you don't really notice it right away as far as the clarity, but you start to notice it as far as the gallons per hour turnover.
And another thing, you said a pro was setting up the canister, which I do agree. It is simple to set up, but it can be a bit of a pain when you're trying to cut the hoses length. So you put the canister under your tank, and then you have to run the hose up to the inlet and outlet, but you have to make sure you cut it precisely. You have to cut it evenly so that there's no air getting in there. It can really be a little bit of a challenge.
You don't want too much droop, and you don't want it too tight.
Exactly. And it's nowhere in comparison to the plumbing on a sump, but I just felt like I would mention that for the canister since we just set up a few and we had a few issues with air bubbles getting in there. It's kind of annoying.
Touche.
Okay, and just to round out a couple more negatives of the canister, and I'm not trying to be negative, I'm just trying to outline everything we got here.
Gotta cover all of our bases.
But yes, in comparison to the sump, there are more pieces that are visible in the tank with a canister. You can usually see the intake and you can see the outflow usually. Even with a 3D background where you're trying to hide it, you can usually see the outflows, so that might clutter your tank just a bit. Definitely not as much as a sponge filter hanging on the back, but the sump is usually really hidden, and you can't really put any other equipment in a canister like you can a sump. And the last thing with the canister is that you can't really control the flow on most of them. So for the instance, with the FX6, one of the more powerful canister filters, you put it on your tank, you're getting that strong flow no matter what. There's really only a few modifications you can make on some of these. You're just gonna get what they are out of the box, which most of the time is completely fine as long as you get the right size for the tank that you're getting. But it can be something that people with a sump prefer more, is to have a little more control on the flow, especially in something like a saltwater tank. Okay, so I know I kind of hinted at a few things I like about a sump, but just to go into a few more specifics, one of the main things I love about a sump is its versatility. You can really customize it to anything you want. You could put all types of equipment throughout the sump, and you can hide your equipment in the sump. Things like heaters that normally stand out in a tank. And as you get in the hobby more and more, you keep more tanks, you start noticing some of the equipment that sticks out gets bulky. But if you can hide it in your sump, it's just awesome that you don't have to see that. And also it opens the door for things like a refugium with live plants. You could put a skimmer in there for like a saltwater tank. There's just so many different things you could do with the different chambers of a sump. And I actually have 2 seamless sumps on my 2 custom aquariums. I've absolutely loved them. They are super high quality, they're easy, durable, and like I said, very customizable. And with that ultimate versatility in a sump, you will also have things like added water volume to your tank, which can really help with parameters. If you have higher water volume, like say you have a 220 gallon tank, but your sump also holds another 100 gallons, that's 320 gallons in total. It really dilutes any toxins in the tank, any nitrates that build up. You really have much more stable water parameters when you have more water. So a sump can really help you in any of those scenarios. And with that extra tank volume, usually the evaporation in your tank is way less of an issue. You can keep your tank running without topping it off for way longer, especially in something like the seamless sump that has a water reservoir, which might have another 40 to 50 gallons of water just sitting there, and it really keeps things even and consistent in your tank. And the last pro that I'll add here for the sump, just the easy to maintain aspect of it. Like we said with canisters, it can be a super big hassle to just clean a canister filter, lugging that big heavy bucket out of there. But with a sump, you can really just pull it right out of the top of the sump, rinse out the sponges, put the sponges back in. It's super quick and easy, and it just makes for a really seamless process whenever you have to do tank maintenance. You don't really have to get your hands as dirty when it comes to the filter.
So I can definitely not disagree with any of the pros of having a sump filter. If you can have a sump filter and you know how to deal with the plumbing, I think you should probably definitely do that. One issue I could come up with though with having a sump filter, what if you don't really know how to plumb a sump filter? Like Troy said, fixing or changing things out of a sump filter can be pretty easy as far as physically. You don't have to take out a 50-pound canister filter when you are fixing or replacing things out of a filter in a sump, but you also got to know what you're doing. There's a lot of versatility that comes with having a sump, but also there's not a lot of instruction that goes along with it. So typically when you get a sump, you basically get an aquarium that you put under your show aquarium, and you are in charge of fixing and maintaining all the plumbing parts of that sump filter. If you're uncomfortable with those type of things, it can be a little bit daunting to have that sump. While the sump filter adds a lot of water volume and a lot of versatility, the canister filter provides a lot of simplicity because they come with instructions and all the parts that you will ever need, and it's really just simple. It's physically taxing when you're trying to replace things or clean things within a canister filter as opposed to a sump filter, but at least you don't have to be a plumbing expert.
Yeah, and I would say I've done 3 sumps on tanks in the past. My first was a saltwater tank where I plumbed that sump, and I was trying to figure it out on the fly. I was watching a lot of tutorials, researching a lot of things, but no one has the exact tank and plumbing that you are trying to set up. You kind of have to just figure it out, and it's really not an easy process to just follow directions. I think now I'm pretty comfortable with it now that I've done it a handful of times. The seamless sumps I've set up were relatively straightforward, but it still was a little more complicated than a canister, and there are also parts where you have to glue them together. So if you're trying to set up a tank in the same day, I would not go with a sump. We actually set up a tank for NBA head coach Billy Donovan, and we needed to set up that whole tank in one day. So we elected to go with 2 FX6 canisters rather than a sump because we wouldn't have had the time to let the glue and silicone or whatever else on the sump dry. And it also just would have taken a lot longer to cut all the pieces we needed for the sump. So there are pros and cons to that. If you have a little bit of time, and maybe it's something that you like to do in terms of plumbing or figuring things out, I think the sump could be good, but I do agree it is kind of a negative. And kind of a small negative to this is even if you are good at making a sump and plumbing, there might be more leaks to a sump than a canister. And the leaks usually happen around the ball valves or the connections from a pipe to an elbow, for instance. Every time I've set up a sump, there's at least one little spot that leaks. So you just have to keep that in mind with a sump.
Yeah, I think all those are very true. And while you're going to go ahead and give a couple negatives on sumps yourself, I got to give a couple negatives on canisters. The one negative with canister filters is that there's not a whole lot of options for bigger canister filters. FX6s are kind of the biggest canister filter, and there's nothing bigger beyond that. Where sumps, you kind of have a lot of versatility. You can put a whole 125 gallon tank below your tank and use that as your sump filtration. If you're using a canister, you're at the mercy of the companies and the sizes that they offer.
For instance, if you have a 600 gallon tank, you might need 3 or 4 FX6s, but if you just get a huge sump, you just have one sump. So that's kind of your point of having a very big tank. You might want to go with a sump just for that, seamless nature of it rather than having a ton of hoses going to a big tank. And even though I am on the side of getting a sump when you can, now that I have experience with them, a couple other negatives of a sump would be possible noise.
True.
I think the canister is very quiet, like you said, but most of the time you'll have some type of trickling water in your sump, and you can hear that. If it's in a living space, for instance, you might hear a trickling water sound, and that's not appeasing to everyone. There are some things you can do to reduce that, like putting a lot of filter floss in the drain pipes that come in, maybe filter socks that are really efficient. But even when I've done that, there is still a slightly more noise than a canister. The other thing is the risk of flooding. I would say if the power goes out, if anything happens in your tank, a canister is pretty safe.
Yeah.
If you don't have just some good safeguards in place, like a good pump or siphon stoppers at the top of your return pipes, that can result in flooding in some instances. It takes a little bit of experience to know how to level out a sump versus the tank. And when you turn off the sump, water might drain in, or if you blast your pump, you might be draining your sump. So there's just a little bit of knowledge that goes into that. But once you get the hang of it, it really isn't that bad, and actually something that you may prefer.
Yeah, so correct me if I'm wrong, Troy, but it basically comes down to how big is your tank? You know, if you have a tank that's bigger than 220 gallons, maybe it's 250, 300, 500, and if you have some experience with plumbing and filtration, I would say probably sump is the best for you. And you can really use a sump at any size tank if you feel comfortable doing the plumbing and things like that. So it kind of comes down to where you're at in the hobby, how interested are you in the plumbing aspect, and how knowledgeable are you, how willing are you to do the research.
Yep, and I would say the last aspect to both of these that we should probably talk about is cost. And I think some people would say, oh, canisters are going to be less expensive, but
Not necessarily.
But if you have to buy multiple, it could add up. So FX6s almost go for about $400 now. So 2 FX6s, $800. You can get a really impressive custom-made sump for around that. But there are other glass tanks that you could do. You could do a DIY sump and really save a lot of money. Again, you have to have a little bit of knowledge of plumbing and just the DIY nature of things, but if you want to save money and you want to do the research, sump is the way to go. If you want to just get something right off the shelf, canisters would be the way to go. And in terms of cost, I think you could probably say they're equal. I think you more so just need to look at the list that we gave before this of what makes the most sense for you, and then you can figure out how much it's actually going to cost based on your tank size and the DIY nature of your potential sump, or the number of canisters and the type of canisters that you're going to go with.
I gotta say, I'm kind of convinced on both ways. I still like my canister filters, but you also convinced me to try a sump someday. I can't wait to try it. And I know you've done a great job with your sumps, and Custom Aquariums does a great job with their sumps. We're not just saying that because we have them. They are great and simple to set up as sump filters.
Hopefully this video is helpful for you selecting your future filter or improving what you currently have. And thanks again for watching. See you on the next one.